Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was a little surprised, as Dr. Womack has mentioned, I am the author of 2 cocktail books. So when he suggested that I speak about moderation, I was worried that this was an intervention of some kind. Another interesting thing is that when Dr. Womack and I were planning this talk, the timing of it did not occur to us. And depending on your point of view, this is either an appropriate timing or an ironic timing. It could be ironic because in many places tomorrow begins Carnival, the pre-Lenten time of festivity and excess, which culminates with Mardi Gras. So not a period well known for its moderation. But the timing could also be seen as appropriate because, of course, Mardi Gras is the last hurrah before Lent, which is all about moderation and then some. So you can take this lecture either as a dour, wet blanket on your Mardi Gras festivities or an uplifting primer on the importance of the upcoming 40 days of Lent. Hopefully, I will be more uplifting than dour, but I will also admit the obvious. Moderation is a virtue that is initially difficult to get excited about. Think of moderation in comparison to the other 4 cardinal virtues. Courage. Now, courage sounds awesome. I mean, who doesn't want to have courage? And who doesn't need a little more prudence in one's life? And who's opposed to justice? These virtues all sound exciting and wonderful. But moderation? It has the feel of a necessary inconvenience, like filling up the gas tank in order to get to where you really want to go. And let's face it, if we could get away with being immoderate without facing any of the consequences for doing so, we just might do it. You may have heard the old Irish joke about the priest who was worried about one of his parishioners' eating and drinking habits. "Remember, Murphy," the priest solemnly warned, "that temperance is a virtue." To which Murphy replied, "Ah, I know 'tis true, Father, especially in moderation." Like Murphy, many of us prefer to have our temperance in moderation. So tonight, to sort of clear the air on this, I would like to do 3 things. Discuss why moderation is an exciting virtue after all. Discuss what has happened to moderation in contemporary society. And discuss, finally, a Christian version of moderation. So let's start with the first. Moderation is a peculiar virtue in one respect. It's peculiar because, on the one hand, it is a distinct virtue, distinguishable from, say, the other cardinal virtues. It chiefly concerns the perfection of your physical appetites concerning food and drink. But in addition to being a distinct virtue, it is also a characteristic that is essential to all virtues. Because all virtues involve some kind of a moderation that finds a happy mean between 2 extremes. All virtues, or moral virtues, are in some way moderate. So you have moderation as a distinct virtue, but you also have moderation as this universal trait of all virtue. It is for this reason that some ancient philosophers described moderation as the greatest of all virtues and even the mother of all virtues, for without it, no other virtue can be born. For Cicero, for example, moderation was synonymous with frugality, but frugality is not stinginess. On the contrary, the word frugalitas comes from the Latin word for fruit, or a fruitful enjoyment. It is the frugalitas, the self-restraint and concentration of the plant, so to speak, that bears fruit. True frugality is not constrictive, but rather a spiritual fertility that begets higher joys. The 20th century Thomist Joseph Pieper would agree. In his explanation of the virtue of moderation in the Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, Pieper characterizes moderation not as an avoidance of pleasure or a fear of exuberance, but as a means of integrating the soul according to its highest and most important principles, disposing its various parts into one unified and ordered whole. Such an integration is important, for without it, knowledge and wisdom, which enable men and women to live well, are enormously difficult to attain. The sin of what Pieper calls unchastity, for example, is not destructive because it is a turn to the sexual in and of itself, but rather because it, quote, constricts man and thus renders him incapable of sensing objective reality. The unchaste person's constantly strained will to pleasure, Pieper explains, prevents him from confronting reality with that selfless detachment which alone makes genuine knowledge possible. Not surprisingly, unchastity, to say nothing of the immoderate life as a whole, most effectively falsifies and corrupts what Pieper calls the mother and mold of all cardinal virtues, prudence. If you don't have moderation, if you don't have temperance, you cannot have prudence. You cannot have the intellectual clarity to see reality properly if your eyes are clouded up by this fog of disordered desires. That is Pieper's argument. Moderation is also choice-worthy for its own sake because it perfects one's physical appetites. And there is nothing more satisfying than perfection, than a thing being the very best thing it can possibly be. Why settle for mundane passions like hunger and thirst when you can have perfected passions, clean, burning passions with the virtue of moderation? The secret joy of moderation was not lost in the ancient world, even among the Epicureans. Today, when we think of the Epicureans, we think of gluttons or hedonists. And indeed, this school of philosophy was very much centered on the material. They denied the immortality of the soul and taught that the highest good was physical pleasure. So they were sort of the black sheep of classical philosophy. But contrary to what you might expect, the Epicureans were also renowned for their moderation. Why? Because they knew that to maximize physical pleasure, you need to be moderate. It is when you eat and drink to excess that you start to see a diminishing return on your investments. And just as moderation is good for the individual because it perfects one's physical appetites and enables him to acquire other virtues and enjoy higher goods, it is also crucial to public well-being. Douglas Creese observes that perhaps the most fundamental political problem is how to merge individual goods into the common good. How do we make I and mine mean we and ours? Moderation is instrumental in effecting such a difficult transformation. Drawing from Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, Creese argues that one of the essential components to political harmony is the moderating of the citizens' desires for material or unshareable goods. Goods that, unlike truth or knowledge, cannot be infinitely distributed. Competition over unshareable goods can be dangerously unstable and divisive. giving rise not only to the unrestrained ambitions of the tyrant, but threatening the very cohesion of the citizenry. In Aristotle's view, Kreis writes, so long as one craves external goods and thereby lacks moderation, there can be no solution to the conflict between love of self and love of others, and indeed, no peace within political life generally. For external goods are limited, but desire is not. For those for whom the good is material, more is better, and the only way to get more of a scarce object is to acquire it from others who are usually equally immoderate. So do you understand the argument that politics is about unshareable goods? There are only so many resources, and we as a political community need to figure out how these unshareable goods can be shared in their limited way. And the only way we can actually ever really make this work is that if we cultivate self-restraint so that we don't get into a feeding frenzy over these unshareable goods. And the only way to cultivate that self-restraint is the virtue of moderation. Moderation, you still need unshareable goods. You're a soul inhabiting a body, and the body has goods that require unshareable goods. But the soul is also ordered towards the infinitely shareable goods of truth and knowledge. So the best political community will be a community that privileges the shareable over the unshareable goods. And moderation is a crucial virtue in helping that transformation. Systemic immoderation or intemperance undermines the vitality of public life by increasing antagonism and strife among citizens and eroding any shared sense of the common good. So, if moderation is so great, then why is it not appreciated so much anymore? The answer to this question brings me to the second part of the talk, the plight of moderation in modernity. Without going into too much detail, it can be said that modern political theory is based on a doctrine of enlightened self-interest that does not require the cultivation of genuine virtue, but the sidelining of it. Consider, for example, the philosophy of John Locke, whom I'm glad is not represented looking down at me as I say bad things about him. Instead of the Aristotelian solution that we just talked about of converting one's desire from unshareable to shareable goods, Locke claims to have found a safer way to achieve a similar result. In the words of Father Ernest Fortin, Locke's trick consists in using private vice or selfishness to procure public benefits. Since self-interest means, politically at any rate, the accumulation and preservation of property, we are led to the view that acquisitiveness and, ultimately, unlimited acquisitiveness is more conducive to the good of society than such virtues as moderation and liberality. In their desire to make money for themselves, entrepreneurs create jobs for others, who likewise become richer. Everyone is better off. Two things suffice to produce the desired result: enlightenment and positive law. People need only to understand that it is in their own interest to abide by the law. They will shun injustice if they see it as unprofitable. Honesty is the best policy and nothing more. Moral virtue, as something choice-worthy for its own sake, is replaced by the mere transition from unenlightened to enlightened self-interest. There's no need to be concerned with the common good, which is procured automatically by the fact that each individual is now free to pursue his selfish goals and encouraged to do so. Instrumental or bourgeois virtue is all that is required of anyone. Mandeville, one of Locke's early disciples, stated the issue in a nutshell when, in The Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits, he argued that the day bees started worrying about moral virtue, the hive would be ruined and would recover its prosperity only when each one returned to its vices. I don't think Mandeville knew very much about bees. But it is a small step from Locke and Mandeville's private vice as public benefit argument to Gordon Gekko's famous speech, "Greed is good. Greed works." As Alistair MacIntyre notes, intemperate economies prefer intemperate behavior. It is highly agreeable and useful to those who market certain kinds of consumer goods that there should be intemperate consumers. Their own vice of acquisitiveness makes the vice of intemperateness in others agreeable and useful to them. Within today's economic political context, an objective good like moderation is even liable to be construed, in MacIntyre's phrase, as, quote, socially disruptive. There is admittedly something quite reasonable about Locke's solution, for what is more reliable than man's love of vice? And there is even something exciting about it, for it betokens an unleashing of energies like the world has never seen. To give a minor but interesting example of the modern enthusiasm for excess, pursuit, the man who coined the motto of the modern Olympic Games was a Dominican abbot named Henri Didon. Father Didon was a sports nut, and he encouraged athletic competition at his school as a way of building character. It was at a meeting in 1891 that he ended a speech to his pupils with the stirring admonition, "Citius, fortius, altius," faster, stronger, higher. The father of modern Olympics, Pierre de Coubertin, liked this phrase and adopted it, but he deliberately changed the word order. Whereas Father Didon had placed the word fortius, or stronger, in the middle of the phrase to stress the moral significance of athletics, Coubertin put altius, or higher, in the middle to stress, quote, the freedom of excess, which he praised over and against, quote, the unnatural utopia of moderation. That phrase, the unnatural utopia of moderation, in a nutshell, is the modern critique of the ancients. This sounds all nice, but it's utopian thinking, to think that human beings could be meaningfully moderate. Let's bank on their selfishness instead. I mean, there is something to the argument one cannot deny. Despite all of his praise of vice and excess, however, all of this praise of vice and excess, modernity does not dismiss the virtues entirely. Rather, it instrumentalizes them. While the ancients used virtue to perfect and rule human passions and emotions, the moderns have used virtue to serve those passions and be subordinate to them. The greedy man, for example, has an excessive and unrestrained love of money, but he must exercise at times enormous discipline and self-sacrifice to acquire and hoard his treasure. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, right? An enormously disciplined man in his own way, which betokens a certain kind of moderation, but he's not moderate. The junkie lacks all moderation with respect to his addiction, but in order to feed his habits, he must at other times exercise restraint, preparation, and other salutary qualities. Hence the first half of the title of tonight's talk. Modernity does not so much flat out reject moderation as it subordinates it to other goals. It seeks not a dollop but a pinch of moderation to ensure success in the unleashing of passions and energies. Hence, Kreis's conclusion that modern political philosophy tends to demote the role of moderation in political life, dismissing it as unnecessary or even deleterious. Well, at this point, we might be tempted to say, so what? If moderation was holding us back from wealth and progress and a more vibrant economy, then good riddance to it. The problem, I'm glad you're not nodding enthusiastically. The problem is not that the modern project has failed to achieve its goals. The problem is the unintended side effects. Simply put, despite his great success, modern man remains unhappy, restless, and, as Thoreau famously put it, leading a life of quiet despair. What could be the source of this malaise? According to Thomas Hibb, who happens to be my boss at Baylor, but that's not why I'm quoting him, it is precisely a lack of moderation that causes this malaise. Which of the cardinal virtues, Hibbs asks, provides a better vantage point from which to diagnose that condition of restlessness of soul which Tocqueville identifies as the peculiar mark of the American spirit? Is not immoderation the source of what Tocqueville calls, quote, our strange melancholy in the midst of plenty? One of the most chilling lines in Democracy in America. Americans are so productive, we're so hardworking, but Tocqueville asks, but what is this strange melancholy in the midst of plenty? Why aren't Americans happier? Why aren't they enjoying the fruits of their success more? Temperance or moderation, Joseph Pieper reminds us, is the virtue most intimately connected with integrity of self, with the disposition of the parts of the self in a unified whole. It should therefore not surprise us when a sense of rootlessness and disquiet reigns in an immoderate soul. Moderation is what brings peace to the soul, integrity to the soul, is what Pieper argues. Which brings us to the third part of our talk and the final half of our title. The Christian solution, or I should say at least one Christian solution, to the modern dogma of a pinch of moderation is moderation with a pinch. That is to say, moderation that hurts just a little bit. This serves as a corrective to the excessive culture and unrestrained culture in which we live. The traditional term for moderation with a pinch is mortification of the flesh, or asceticism. Both of these are notions that are very easily misunderstood in today's society. Most people, for example, tend to think of mortification of the flesh or asceticism as a hatred of the body or a disdain for the physical world, a kind of a spiritual anorexia. But this negative judgment is not an accurate reflection of the purpose and character of Christian asceticism. The very word, the Greek word ascesis, from which asceticism is derived, means exercise or training, like the preparation of an athlete or a soldier. Athletes and soldiers undergo rigorous training not because they enjoy the bitter taste of deprivation, but because they want the sweet taste of victory. And the same goes with Christian asceticism. It springs not from a negative reaction to creation or material goodness, but for a positive desire for an even higher, incorruptible crown. It is for this reason that St. Paul wrote of chastising his body and bringing it into subjection. Mortifying our flesh through practices such as fasting, abstaining from various illicit pleasures, or keeping vigil, also encourages the virtue of moderation and self-restraint, which is key to our happiness. In the words of the great Russian dissident Alexandra Solzhenitsyn, "If you will permit me to share a personal observation, we can only experience true spiritual satisfaction not in seizing, but in refusing to seize. In other words, in self-limitation." He continues, "It is difficult to bring ourselves to sacrifice and self-denial, because in political, public, and private life, we have long since dropped the golden key of self-restraint to the ocean floor. But self-limitation is the fundamental and wisest aim of a man who has obtained his freedom. Self-limitation is the fundamental and wisest aim of a man who has obtained his freedom." This from a man who spent decades in a Siberian gulag. Solzhenitsyn's remarks about true spiritual satisfaction are echoed in a prayer that will be prayed in some places this coming season of Lent. This is what's called a collect from the traditional Roman Missal. Listen to this prayer. "Grant, we beseech you, O Lord, a saving power to our fasts, that the chastisement of the flesh, which we have taken upon us, may pass over into a liveliness of our souls." May the chastisement of our flesh pass over into a livelier soul. The word here for chastisement in Latin can also mean pruning. Castigatio can mean either a chastising or a pruning. And the word for liveliness here is vegetatio. So there's this little horticultural motif that's hard to translate, but it gives us a clue into the purpose of mortification of the flesh, chastisement. Why does a gardener prune his plants? Because he hates them? Because he wants to punish them for growing? Or is it because he wants them to flourish? For he knows that the secret of making them more productive is to trim them. The same is true of Christian mortification, which understands that, like certain plants, bodily appetites require a dexterous pruning in order to lead to a blossoming of the soul. Another place where you will find this paradoxical truth expressed is the motto of the Abbey of Monte Cassino, the mother house of the entire Benedictine order, which flourished over many centuries despite an astonishing number of natural disasters and human depredations. Their motto is "Succisa virescit," cut down, it grows green. The image is taken from viticulture, which requires that in order for a grapevine to produce bunches of grapes, as much as 90% of the vines must be pruned every year. Every year, 90% of a grapevine plant, 90% of it must be pruned down. Texas is becoming a great wine-growing state, so you all need to know this. That is why, after calling himself the true vine and his Father the husbandman, Jesus Christ tells his disciples that his Father will prune every fruit-bearing branch that it may bear more fruit. This is chapter 15 of the Gospel of St. John. Asceticism, needless to say, has fallen onto hard times today, with many Christians dismissing these practices as outdated or medieval, which for me is not a bad word, but apparently for others it is. Yet because human nature does not change, and because the modern solution can be deceptive, the need for mortification, I would argue, is as strong as ever, if not stronger. Moderation with a pinch remains one of the keys to authentic spiritual vitality and happiness. In the words of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, you are built for love. And if you are built for love, you are built for giving, for renunciation, and for the pruning of yourself. Only if you give yourself, if you lose yourself, as Christ puts it, will you be able to live. Perhaps with the help of a little mortification, we will be able to appreciate yet again those words of Goethe, out of moderation, a pure happiness springs. Thank you.